You do it every day. You have done it every day of your life, in every home, every hotel, every rest stop along every highway you have ever traveled. You reach for it without thinking. It is so woven into the fabric of modern life that its absence, even for a single day, feels like a civilizational collapse. And yet toilet paper, this roll of perforated white sheets that you regard as one of the most basic of all necessities, has existed in its modern, purchasable, widely available form for fewer than 170 years. The ancient Romans built aqueducts that carried millions of gallons of water across mountains. They constructed amphitheaters that seated 50,000 people. They mapped the stars, codified law, and engineered roads that still carry traffic 2,000 years later. And when they were finished with their business in the latrine, they reached not for paper, but for a sponge fixed to the end of a stick, a tool they rinsed in shared water and left for the next user. That is not a footnote. That is civilization at its height, solving one of the most universal of all human problems with a communal sponge on a stick. Before the perforated roll, before the sanitized package, before the supermarket shelf stocked floor to ceiling, with a product we now consider too basic to even name in polite company, human beings across every culture and every era improvised. They reached for whatever was at hand: smooth stones, leaves, broken ceramic, cloth, corn husks, moss, straw. And in at least one documented case, a piece of silk cut into a careful rectangle and tucked into a pocket. The story of toilet paper is not, at its core, a story about hygiene. It is a story about what we will endure, what we will invent, and how a single small object, once it arrives, quietly reorganizes the way civilization thinks about the body, about cleanliness, about privacy, and about what it means to be a person who deserves comfort. It begins not with paper, but with a world in which paper had not yet occurred to anyone as the answer, and the solutions people found in its absence were stranger, more ingenious, more dangerous, and more revealing than anything that came after. Before any civilization thought to manufacture a solution, the earth itself was the supply depot. Leaves were the default, abundant, soft when fresh, shaped by nature into something almost purposeful. Across the forests of ancient Europe and Asia, people reached for whatever grew nearest: broad dock leaves, mullein, moss pulled from riverbanks, handfuls of grass torn from the ground. There was no ceremony to it. There was no choice. The body demanded, and the landscape answered in whatever form it took that season, in that climate, on that particular patch of ground. Summer offered one answer, winter offered another, and considerably less pleasant an answer at that. In colder climates, snow became a tool, cold, brief, and efficient in its own brutal way, though it required a tolerance for discomfort that most modern sensibilities would find extraordinary. Ice and frozen moss served the same function in the far northern reaches of human settlement, where warmth was already a scarce resource, and adding cold to vulnerability was simply the price of living. Nomadic peoples on the Central Asian steppe used dried grass and animal wool, whatever could be gathered from the landscape they moved through. The logic was consistent everywhere. Humans used what was immediately available, improvised without complaint, and moved on. The remarkable thing is not the improvisation itself. Humans improvise constantly, but the sheer geographic consistency of the problem and the creativity of regional solutions. Every civilization, on every continent, arrived at the same biological necessity and solved it differently, based entirely on what their environment placed within arm's reach. That consistency is its own kind of evidence. It tells us that this was not a marginal concern. It was a universal one, a daily one that shaped behavior, informed taboo, and quietly organized social life in ways that rarely made it into the written record, precisely because it was too ordinary, too universal to comment upon. What historians have had to reconstruct from archaeology, from medical texts, from incidental literary references, is the texture of an experience so common that contemporaries saw no reason to document it. The silence in the record is itself a form of testimony. The ancient Greeks approached the problem with characteristic practicality, and, it must be said, a degree of engineering ambition that the subject perhaps did not require. They developed the pesos, a rounded ceramic fragment, smoothed and recut from broken pottery, used for anal cleaning after defecation. The word itself comes from the Greek for a small stone or pebble, and the objects functioned along similar lines: firm, durable, reusable, and available in abundance in a civilization that produced enormous quantities of fired clay. A study published in the BMJ in December 2012 examined pesoi recovered from the Athens Agora and described them as recut ceramic pieces ranging from approximately 3 to 10.5 centimeters in diameter and between 0.6 and 2.2 centimeters thick, small enough to handle, large enough to function, and shaped deliberately rather than selected at random. The same study identified a 6th century BC Greek kylix, a drinking cup, in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, that depicts a man using a pesos, which places the practice firmly in the visual culture of the period, and not merely in the archaeological residue of latrines. The Romans adopted the ceramic approach alongside their own innovation, the tessorium, which the BMJ describes as a sponge fixed to a stick and rinsed in salt water or vinegar after use. Public latrines across the Roman Empire, those long stone benches with holes carved at intervals, open to neighbors on both sides without partition or privacy, provided shared tessoria for communal use. The same sponge, the same stick, the same salt water or vinegar passed from one patron to the next. The Romans were not troubled by this in the way a modern reader might be troubled imagining it. Hygiene meant something different. Shared spaces meant something different. The tessorium was not a sign of poverty or negligence. It was the standard. The researchers at the BMJ also noted that long-term use of the abrasive ceramic pesoi could plausibly have caused local irritation or worsened external hemorrhoids, which is a sentence that rewards reading twice. The instrument of hygiene was, for some users, also an instrument of harm. The cure was built into the problem. On the other side of the ancient world, the Han dynasty was developing its own approach, and the archaeological evidence that survived it is among the most revealing and most medically significant hygiene artifacts ever recovered. At a relay station called Xuanquanzhi, built in 111 BC along the Silk Road in northwestern China and used until around AD 109, archaeologists excavating a latrine site found a collection of personal hygiene sticks, thin implements of wood or bamboo wrapped with cloth and used for wiping after defecation, as documented in the Journal of Archaeological Science, reports in October 2016. The sticks themselves are mundane. What was found on them was not. Microscopic analysis of the fecal material preserved on the cloth wrappings revealed eggs of 4 distinct parasites: Chinese liver fluke, Taenia tapeworm, roundworm, and whipworm. Each of these represented a disease burden carried in the bodies of the travelers and soldiers who passed through the relay station. But the liver fluke finding was the one that rewrote something important. Chinese liver fluke cannot survive in the arid desert climate of the Dunhuang region, where Xuanquanzhi is located. It requires a wet environment: rice paddies, river deltas, the warm, humid lowlands of southern China. Researchers at Cambridge reported that the nearest modern endemic zone for the parasite was approximately 1,500 kilometers from the site, which means the fluke did not live at Xuanquanzhi. A person brought it there, already infected, from somewhere far to the south and east, traveling the road that connected the empire's distant provinces to its western frontier. That person, anonymous, unrecorded, one among thousands who passed through, left behind the molecular evidence of a journey in the most unexpected archival form imaginable: the residue on a hygiene stick discarded in a latrine pit 2,000 years ago. The Cambridge researchers framed this as early archaeological evidence for the movement of infectious disease along trade routes, the Silk Road not merely as a highway of goods and ideas, but as a corridor of contagion, quietly transmitting parasites alongside silk and spices. The sticks are now one of the most cited examples of ancient hygiene archaeology. They are also, in their way, a kind of passport, recording where a traveler had been by what they carried inside them. Here is the paradox at the center of this story. Paper was invented in China. The Chinese had paper centuries before the rest of the world had even conceived of it. And yet, For more than 1,000 years, no civilization outside China thought to use it for the purpose we now consider obvious. The Romans built aqueducts and amphitheaters and legal codes of extraordinary sophistication, and they wiped themselves with a sea sponge on a stick. The Greeks crafted the foundations of philosophy and democracy, and they reached for a piece of broken pottery. Entire civilizations produced writers, architects, generals, and philosophers of the highest order, and not one of them made the connection that seems, from our vantage point, so self-evident. Paper. Of course, paper. The Chinese scholar Yan Zhitui, writing in the 6th century, left behind a small but remarkable sentence. He wrote that he could not bring himself to use paper that bore the names of sages or worthy men for what he called toilet purposes. The sentence is brief, it is almost casual, but it is also a confession, because you do not write a rule against using sacred texts as toilet paper unless people are already doing exactly that. Yan Zhitui's admonition is not a prohibition against an innovation. It is a complaint about a practice already so common that it required moral correction. The Chinese were using paper in the latrine long before they saw any need to manufacture it specifically for that purpose. They were using whatever paper was at hand, discarded documents, wrappers, surplus sheets, and the only question, for a man of learning like Yan Zhitui, was which paper was too important to sacrifice. That 6th century complaint is worth sitting with for a moment. It represents the earliest written record of the practice, which means that the gap between paper's invention and its application in the latrine was not a gap of ignorance. It was a gap of supply. When paper was rare, it was too valuable to waste. When it became abundant, people found every possible use for it, including the most intimate one. The constraint was never the idea, it was always the material. The leap from improvised use to deliberate manufacture took several more centuries, and when it came at imperial scale. By 1393, the Ming Bureau of Imperial Supplies was producing toilet paper as a formal line item in the state's manufacturing ledger. The figures recorded in those accounts are striking. 720,000 large sheets of rice-based toilet paper were produced that year for general use across the imperial court. That number alone, 720,000 sheets, in 1393, describes a civilization that had not only normalized the idea of purpose-made toilet paper, but had industrialized it, budgeted for it, and built a supply chain around it. This was not a luxury experiment. This was procurement. But there was a second figure in those same records, one that tells a more particular story. 15,000 smaller sheets, softer, finer, and perfumed, were manufactured that year for the exclusive use of the Hongwu Emperor and his immediate family. The distinction matters. It tells us that by the late 14th century, toilet paper in China was already differentiated by quality, that softness and scent were understood as refinements worth specifying, and that the imperial household expected something meaningfully better than what the rest of the court received. 720,000 sheets for the court, 15,000 perfumed sheets for the emperor. The categories that still organize toilet paper marketing today, standard, premium, ultra-soft, were already implicit in a Ming dynasty supply order more than 600 years ago. What the Ming records also reveal is the scale of the organizational infrastructure required to make this possible. Someone calculated the need, wrote the order, managed the mills, arranged the delivery, and recorded the figures for posterity. The supply chain for 15,000 perfumed sheets, destined for one man's private use, was as carefully administered as the supply chain for any other imperial necessity. The body, at that level of power, was not merely accommodated. It was served, specifically, with deliberate precision, by a bureaucracy designed for exactly that purpose. The product existed. The logistics existed. The expectation existed. What did not yet exist, anywhere outside China, was the infrastructure to replicate any of it. The rest of the world had no idea. Arab travelers who visited China and wrote accounts of what they observed frequently noted the country's customs with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Among the habits that struck them as genuinely alien was the Chinese use of paper in the latrine. One account, widely cited in later histories, describes the practice not as efficient or practical, but as unclean, because paper, in the Arab world, was a surface for writing, for knowledge, for the sacred. To use it for waste was not merely unusual. It was, to many visitors, a kind of desecration. The material that carried words should not, by any logic familiar to them, be put to this use. The Chinese had arrived at precisely the opposite conclusion. Paper was so abundant, so ordinary, so woven into daily life that no special reverence was required. It was a tool. It could serve any purpose. That gap in perception between a world that treated paper as precious and a world that had enough of it to throw away is itself a measure of how far ahead Chinese paper production had run. The rest of the world would not catch up for centuries. Europe was still more than 400 years away from its first commercial toilet paper product. The Arab world, for all its sophistication in mathematics and medicine and trade, preferred water. The Japanese were carving flat wooden sticks. And the Chinese emperor was receiving 15,000 perfumed sheets delivered on schedule, as though the question of what to do after using the latrine had already been answered, permanently, elegantly, industrially, and the only thing left was to argue about the thread count. There is a pattern that runs through nearly every account of ancient hygiene, and it is not a pattern about cleanliness at all. It is a pattern about power. The Romans built their communal latrines with characteristic engineering confidence, long marble benches suspended over flowing channels. But access to that engineering was not universal. The citizen who could afford a seat in a well-maintained facility in the Forum was not the same person crouching over a ceramic pot in a rented insular room 4 stories above the street, emptying the contents out a window when the night soil collectors announced themselves below. The pesos, that rounded ceramic fragment measured by the BMJ at somewhere between 3 and 10.5 centimeters in diameter, was technically available to anyone who could find a shard of broken pottery. But availability is not the same as comfort, and comfort, in the ancient world, was a thing you purchased. Perfumed cloths, fine linen, the services of a well-appointed private bath. These were not secrets that the wealthy kept hidden. They were displayed, because display was the point. Cleanliness in the ancient world signaled that you had time, that you had resources, that your body was not something you had to simply endure. The poor improvised with whatever the material world left within reach. The rich improvised with considerably better materials and then called the result civilization. This division, between the body as a problem to be managed cheaply and the body as a surface to be maintained with care, is so consistent across cultures and centuries that it begins to feel less like a feature of hygiene history and more like a law of human organization. Wherever there is a gap between what is possible and what is affordable, that gap opens first in the places the body is most private and closes last. And yet the record is almost entirely silent on how most people handled this problem most of the time. The surviving evidence, the pesos from the Athens Agora, the tersorium described in the BMJ's December 2012 feature, the hygiene sticks preserved in the Xuanquanzi relay station latrine, represents a tiny fraction of the actual human behavior it documents. These objects survived because they fell into latrine pits, became waterlogged, were sealed under layers of sediment, and were eventually excavated by archaeologists patient enough to look for them. The ones that did not fall, that were discarded above ground, that decomposed within a season, that were never thrown away at all because they were used again and again until they could not be used any longer. Those have left no trace. What this means, practically, is that the historical record of hygiene is not a record of what people actually did. It is a record of what happened to survive. The elite wrote down what they considered worth writing. Seneca, in his famous letter, mentioned the sponge-tipped stick not because he was interested in hygiene, but because a gladiator had used one to end his own life. The object entered the literary record through violence, not through routine. The routine was beneath documentation. It was too ordinary, too universal, too embarrassing, too human. And so we are left to infer backward from fragments, from the medieval silk rectangles found in the Paderborn latrine, cut deliberately to size, recovered in 2026 alongside a wax tablet notebook dated to the 13th or 14th century, from parasitological residue on wooden sticks, from ceramic sherds worn smooth in ways that stone and weather alone cannot explain. The history of what people used before manufactured paper is written almost entirely in what got left behind by accident. The deliberate record kept, as it often does, its silence. Rome built the ancient world's most ambitious sewers, the most sophisticated aqueducts, the most elaborately engineered public baths, and then it built the foraker, the public latrine, a long stone bench with a row of holes cut into it at regular intervals, open to the air, open to conversation, open to whoever happened to sit down beside you. No partition, no door, no privacy of any kind. In the great public latrines of Rome and Pompeii and Ephesus, men sat together the way they sat at dinner, in company and without embarrassment. Senators conducted business there. Merchants closed deals. Philosophers argued. The foraker was not a place of shame, it was a place of life. And at the center of that life, resting in a channel of flowing water at the feet of every seated visitor, was the tersorium, a sponge fixed to the end of a wooden stick. That was the tool. That was the answer that the Roman Empire, at the height of its engineering genius, at the apex of its civic ambition, had arrived at for the oldest and most unavoidable human problem. The sponge was real. It worked. It was, in the strict sense of the word, reusable. After each use, a visitor would rinse it in the channel of salt water or vinegar water that ran along the floor of the latrine, a detail recorded in a feature published by the BMJ on December 17, 2012, and replace it in the water, available for whoever sat down next. One sponge, shared by everyone. The Romans who built the Pantheon, who laid roads that still exist beneath modern cities, who drafted legal codes that still underpin European law, those Romans passed a communal sponge from stranger to stranger as a matter of unremarkable daily routine. This is not a small detail about ancient plumbing. It is a window into an entirely different understanding of what the body is, what cleanliness means, and what one human being owes another in a shared civic space. The tersorium did not survive only in archaeology, it survived in writing, which is to say, it survived in a moment of extremity so stark that the historian who recorded it could not leave it out. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, in his 71st letter to Lucilius, a collection of moral correspondence that has been read continuously for 2,000 years, describes a German gladiator held in Roman captivity who chose death over the spectacle of the arena. The gladiator's method was not a blade, not a cord. He took the sponge-tipped stick that sat in the latrine adjacent to his cell, pushed it far enough into his own throat, and suffocated. Seneca recounts this not as a grotesque curiosity, but as a philosophical example, proof that the will to die, and therefore the will to live on one's own terms, can find its instrument anywhere. The tersorium was so commonplace, so unremarkable, so present in every latrine in the Roman world that it required no explanation. Seneca did not pause to describe it. His readers needed no footnote. They knew exactly what it was, because they used one every day. That ordinariness is the detail that stays. The sponge on the stick was not special equipment. It was furniture. It was infrastructure. It sat beside the hole in the stone bench, the way a towel sits beside a modern sink, automatically, invisibly, without comment. And because it required no comment, it appears in the historical record almost only by accident. A philosopher reaching for the most vivid possible example of accessible self-determination and finding it in the latrine. History's record of how ordinary people managed ordinary life is like that everywhere. The deliberate record kept, as it often does, its silence. What survives is the incidental, the aside, the sponge, the letter that was meant to be about something else entirely. Set aside for a moment the social ritual of the shared foraker and look at the object itself, because the tersorium is, in material terms, a genuinely elegant piece of design. A natural sea sponge, harvested from the Mediterranean, is among the most absorbent materials available without industrial manufacturing. It is soft. It collapses under pressure and rebounds. It holds liquid and releases it cleanly when wrung. For a civilization without cotton mills, without wood pulp processing, without any of the industrial infrastructure that would one day make disposable paper cheap enough to throw away, the sponge was not a compromise. It was the best available answer. The stick extended the sponge beyond reach of the hand, in a seating position that, on a stone bench with a cut hole, rather than a modern elevated seat, demanded a different geometry of the body. The design solved a real mechanical problem, and the salt water or vinegar in which it rested between uses was not decorative. Salt and vinegar are both genuinely antimicrobial. The Romans did not have germ theory, did not know that bacteria existed, did not understand transmission in any modern sense. But they had centuries of accumulated practical observation, and they knew that things left to sit in vinegar did not rot the way things left to sit in plain water did. The tesorium soaking in its brine was, in that limited but real sense, being sanitized. The system was not nothing. The system was not primitive by the standards of the tools available. What it could not do, what no amount of vinegar could fully accomplish, was break the chain of transmission between one user and the next, when one of those users was carrying something the solution could not neutralize. And, in a densely populated urban latrine, with hundreds of users a day, the chain of transmission never stopped. Not every Roman, and not every Greek before them, relied on the sponge. Alongside the tesorium, and in many cases instead of it, the ancient Mediterranean world used a different instrument entirely, the pesos, a rounded ceramic fragment, recut from a broken pot or tile, smoothed at the edges, used dry, used manually, and discarded, or reused depending on circumstance. The BMJ, in its December 17, 2012 feature, described pesoi, recovered from the Athens Agora, as recut ceramic pieces ranging from 3 to 10.5 centimeters in diameter and from 0.6 to 2.5 centimeters thick. They were, in other words, roughly the size of a large coin to the size of a small coaster, shaped to fit a cupped hand, thin enough not to be clumsy, thick enough to have structural integrity under pressure. A 6th century BC Greek kylix, a shallow drinking cup, in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, depicts on its interior a man in the act of using one. The image is unambiguous, and it is remarkable, a piece of fine painted pottery, the prestige medium of its age, recording a scene of intimate bodily function without shame or irony, as straightforwardly as it recorded athletes, gods, or battle. Pesoi turn up across the archaeological record. Terracotta examples from Roman latrine contexts at Utica in Sicily and at Gortyn in Crete, dated to around the 2nd century AD, were identified in the same BMJ analysis. At Gortyn, microscopy confirmed what context already implied: solidified and partially mineralized excrement on the surface of a pesos, direct physical evidence of its use. The ceramic shard had done exactly what it was made to do. It had also, the BMJ noted, done something its users could not have intended, because long-term use of abrasive ceramic against sensitive skin could plausibly have caused local irritation and may have worsened external hemorrhoids in people who already suffered from them. The instrument that cleaned also, over time, damaged. That tension between the solution and its cost runs through almost every chapter of this story. Here is the thing about Rome that the Foraker makes plain. Sophistication and risk are not opposites. They can travel together, at the same speed, in the same direction, for a very long time. The Roman Empire at its height had running water in its cities, lead-lined pipes carrying it across hundreds of kilometers, heated floors in its bathhouses, and a public health infrastructure that would not be meaningfully exceeded in Europe for more than 1,000 years. It also had a shared sponge on a stick, rinsed in a communal basin, passed between strangers without a second thought. The paradox is not a contradiction. It is a reminder that every civilization solves the problems it can see and lives inside the ones it cannot. The Romans could see dirt, they could see smell, they could engineer around both with a thoroughness that still astonishes. What they could not see, what no one would see for another 17 centuries, was the invisible world of parasites and pathogens that the shared tersorium moved between bodies as efficiently as it moved between hands. The evidence recovered from the Silk Road latrine at Xuanquanji, eggs of liver fluke, tapeworm, roundworm, and whipworm, identified by microscopic analysis of cloth-wrapped hygiene sticks used 2,000 years ago, makes the biological reality of these ancient latrines legible in a way that no ancient writer could have made it. The Romans did not know what they were sharing. The travelers on the Silk Road did not know what they were carrying. They were clean by every standard they possessed, and by a standard they could not yet possess, they were transmitting disease with every act of cleanliness. That is not a Roman failure, it is a human condition. We are always cleanest by yesterday's understanding, and always in ways we cannot yet see, carrying something forward. The question that the opening of this story quietly posed, why, if humans had been solving this problem for millennia with ceramic shards and sponges on sticks and bamboo wrapped in cloth, did the mass-produced paper roll not arrive until the 19th century, has an answer that is less about ignorance than about infrastructure. The Roman tersorium required communal latrines. The Chinese imperial court required a bureaucracy capable of manufacturing 720,000 sheets in a single year. The Silk Road traveler required a relay station with a latrine and a holding tank. Every solution, in every civilization, emerged from a specific architecture of daily life. And when that architecture collapsed, the solution collapsed with it. Medieval Europe did not simply fail to invent toilet paper. Medieval Europe largely failed to build the enclosed, permanent, waste-managing interior rooms that would have made toilet paper necessary. The garderobe, a stone shaft cut into a castle wall, open at the bottom, contents falling to a pit or a moat, required nothing more sophisticated than gravity. You did not need a roll of anything if the transaction was conducted standing over a hole in a floor. Straw was available. Hay was available. Moss, in wetter climates, was abundant and surprisingly effective. The poor used their left hand and water, a practice so widespread across the ancient and medieval world that the distinction between the clean hand and the unclean hand became encoded into social ritual, into dining etiquette, into religious law across multiple faiths and continents simultaneously, not by coincidence, but because the underlying physical reality was universal. The rich used whatever fabric came to hand. And in Paderborn, Germany, in a latrine that has only recently been excavated for a new city administration building, archaeologists found silk, actual silk, cut into small rectangles, dating to the 13th or 14th century, suspected by researchers from the Landschaftsverband Westfalen-Lippe to have served exactly this purpose. Silk, not the cheapest fabric available, the most expensive. What you used said everything about who you were. When Joseph Gaetti placed an advertisement in New York in 1857 for what he called J.C. Gaetti's medicated paper for the water closet, he was not solving a problem that people did not know they had. He was solving a problem that people refused to discuss in public. This is the real reason the product arrived so late. Not lack of technology. Paper had existed in China for over a millennium before Gaetti printed his name on 500 sheets and sold them for 50 cents a package. Not lack of demand. The demand was, by definition, universal and daily. The obstacle was that the demand could not be spoken of. Polite Victorian society had developed an elaborate architecture of euphemism around the body and its functions, and the further up the social scale you climbed, the more impenetrable that architecture became. You could not advertise a product that solved a problem that did not officially exist. Gaetti's solution was the word medicated. Frame the paper not as a cleaning tool, but as a therapeutic one, not as hygiene, but as medicine. And suddenly the conversation became permissible. His name was watermarked into every sheet. The product was real, the need was real, but the commercial machinery was slow. 14 years after Gaetti's advertisement, in 1871, Seth Wheeler of Albany received a United States patent for rolled wrapping paper perforated between sheets. He incorporated the Albany Perforated Wrapping Paper Company in 1877. On April 9, 1889, the Patent Office granted Wheeler U.S. Patent number 401,233 for a toilet or wrapping paper roll with incisions and perforations aligned for suspension. And on September 15, 1891, patent number 459,516 arrived. A roll designed so that sheets could be severed simply by pulling the free end. The perforated roll, as the modern world understands it, was now a legal document. What remained was to convince the modern world to buy it. Irwin and Clarence Scott organized the Scott Paper Company in 1879 as a paper goods jobbing operation in Philadelphia. Through the 1880s and into the 1890s, they cut and converted toilet tissue rolls to merchant specifications, quietly, without advertising their own name on the product, because the cultural taboo was still formidable enough that some retailers refused to stock anything with the words toilet paper on the label. Scott sold under the merchant's brand. The product moved through the back door of polite commerce because the front door was still locked. It was not until 1910 that Scott Paper Company began manufacturing its own bathroom tissue and marketing it primarily under the Waldorf label, a name that carried no anatomical information whatsoever, only the faint prestige of a hotel. This is the arc that the whole history traces, from the Roman tersorium rinsed in salt water or vinegar to a product sold under a hotel's name because its actual purpose could not be printed on the box. Civilization had not progressed from ignorance to knowledge. It had progressed from openness to shame and back, very slowly, toward a kind of functional honesty. The physical mechanics of Seth Wheeler's perforated roll, the incisions aligned for suspension, the free end pulled to sever, were elegant and simple. The cultural mechanics required 30 more years of careful euphemism before an industry could be built on them. And once the industry existed, it proved nearly indestructible. In Japan, in November of 1973, during the oil shock, a supermarket in Osaka's Senri New Town sold 1,400 packs of toilet paper in a single hour. Not because toilet paper was scarce, but because people feared it would become so. The product that had taken millennia to invent and decades to market had, within a human generation, become the object whose absence people could not imagine surviving. There is a version of this story that ends with the perforated roll as a triumph, the clean, efficient, hygienic resolution to a problem as old as the species. That version is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The fuller version is this: for most of human history, the problem was solved. It was solved with a tersorium rinsed in salt water or vinegar, a practice so standard in Greco-Roman culture that when Seneca recorded a gladiator using one to take his own life in letter 70 to Lucilius, he did so without explanation, because no explanation was needed. Every reader knew exactly what the object was. It was solved with pissoi, rounded ceramic fragments, the pieces recovered from Gortyn in Crete, dating to around the 2nd century, examined under microscopy, confirmed by the traces of what they had been used to clean. The pieces from the Athens Agora ran from 3 to 10.5 centimeters in diameter, 0.6 to 2.2 centimeters thick, small, precise, practical, and, over long use, the BMJ researchers noted, plausibly damaging in ways that required no further elaboration. The hygiene sticks wrapped in cloth at the Han Dynasty relay station at Xuanquanzhi were used for roughly 220 years, from 111 BC until AD 109, and they recorded in their fibers, invisibly, the eggs of 4 distinct parasites: Chinese liver fluke, Taenia tapeworm, roundworm, and whipworm. The liver fluke could not have come from the arid region around Dunhuang. The nearest endemic territory was approximately 1,500 kilometers away. The stick was a document. It recorded a journey. What humans used to clean themselves was never simply a hygiene tool. It was a mirror of available technology, social structure, material culture, and the specific anxieties of each civilization about the body and what it produced. The modern roll, perforated at regular intervals, suspended on a bracket, pulled free with one hand, it solved the problem. It also ended the conversation, and in ending it, it quietly erased 2,000 years of human ingenuity that had been working on exactly the same question, with whatever could be found. Before the perforated roll arrived, 2,000 years of human ingenuity had been quietly at work on the same question, with stones, sponges, silk, and straw. The object solved the problem, and in doing so, erased the conversation entirely. That erasure is the story of nearly every object in your home. And if that is the kind of history you want to see, subscribe to the Object Chronicles so you never miss the next one.